Please look at me once." The words tore out of her before she could stop them, and Clara Quinlan dropped to her knees in the snow. Not on a sidewalk, on the drop-off lane of the Fairmont Copley Plaza. 3 steps from a pair of $10,000 shoes, in a waitress uniform that still smelled of bacon grease from a double shift she'd finished 40 minutes earlier. No coat. Her name tag from Nolan's diner hung crooked at her chest, and her hands cracked, red, ruined by years of scalding dishwater, held a small tin can box against her ribs, like it was the only thing left in the world that belonged to her. The black Maybach behind her stopped so hard the tires screamed. Somebody's hand went under a coat. For 1 second, nobody in that crowd moved. And Sebastian Fallon, 37 years old, the man who ran the Fallon organization, who owned Terminals 4 and 6 of Boston Harbor and every longshoreman who set foot on them, the man whose name people in this city said quietly, or didn't say at all, turned around slowly, because men like him don't flinch. He'd just stepped out with his fiancée on his arm, Priscilla Vane. Beacon Hill money, Ivy League smile. A $2 million engagement party still glowing behind them. The guests already had their phones up. This was going to be somebody's post by midnight. 2 of Sebastian's men grabbed Clara by the arms, and here's the part that made him stop. She didn't fight. She didn't kick. She didn't scream. She just leaned harder toward him, the way a person leans toward a door that's about to close forever. And then Priscilla did something Sebastian would think about for the rest of his life. She didn't wait for the men. She reached down herself, took a fistful of Clara's hair, and yanked while her voice stayed perfectly sweet, perfectly warm, perfectly practiced. "This poor girl's ill, darling. I used to employ her. Let me handle it." Clara went sideways into the slush. She didn't get up. She crawled on her knees, on her torn hands back toward him. And when Priscilla's heel came down on her fingers, she didn't cry out. Not once. She only lifted her chin and looked at him, snow melting on her lashes, and said the thing she'd walked 4 miles through a blizzard to say. "I didn't steal anything. She did. And you're the only man alive who can prove it." A mob boss stood in the falling snow, looking down at a waitress who shouldn't have meant anything to him at all. Nobody around them breathed. His men were waiting for the word, one word, and this whole thing would be over before the valet finished parking the car. His fiancée's hand was still knotted in that girl's hair, and her voice had started climbing fast, too fast, filling the silence with explanations nobody had asked for. But Sebastian wasn't listening to her anymore. He was looking at the woman on her knees, at her face. Really looking. And what he saw in those gray-blue eyes made something cold turn over in his chest, something he had absolutely no name for and no way to explain. If this story moves you, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss what comes next. It genuinely means the world to us. Thank you for being here. Now, let's go back to the snow outside the Fairmont Copley Plaza, because the woman on her knees was about to tell Sebastian Fallon exactly who she was, and nothing in his life would ever be the same again. Sebastian raised one hand. Just one hand, held at waist level, no higher. He didn't say a single word, and Priscilla Vane froze. Her fingers were still tangled tightly in Clara's hair, but they had stopped pulling, stopped tightening, stopped doing anything at all, as though someone had suddenly unplugged her arm. She didn't dare let go. She didn't dare keep holding on. She simply stood there in the arrival lane, wearing a silk gown worth 3 months of wages for the 40 people watching her. And for the first time that evening, she was silent. The man standing at Sebastian's left shoulder wasn't a bodyguard. His name was Fintan Doyle. He was 45 years old, and in the past 22 years, he had never needed to ask Sebastian Fallon the same question twice. The man at his right shoulder was Emmett Barlow. 41, with a face as flat as a plank and eyes that had already counted every exit from the courtyard before the Maybach had even stopped. Those 2 men didn't watch doors. They watched the harbor. They watched the Union. They watched the men who watched those things. And when Sebastian opened his mouth, his voice was so low that the guests on the steps leaned forward and still couldn't hear him clearly. "Cancel the flight," he said. Fintan had already taken out his phone before the final word reached the air. No question, no raised eyebrow. His thumb had finished typing 3 words before Emmett even had time to turn his head. That was how people recognized an organization, not by its guns, but by its delay. In the Fallon house, there was no delay. "Take her inside," Sebastian continued. Then he slowly turned his head and looked at his fiancée for the first time since stepping out of the car. "Priscilla, You don't leave my sight." Her hand fell from Clara's hair as though she had touched a hot stove. "Sebastian, this is ridiculous. I was only trying to protect you from a scandal." "This girl, I didn't ask you anything." His voice didn't rise by so much as an inch. But there was something in those 6 words that made the valet standing 26 feet away decide he urgently needed to be busy somewhere else. Priscilla closed her mouth. She closed it beautifully, slowly, exactly the way a woman raised on Beacon Hill closed her mouth when she understood that what had just happened would be remembered. Sebastian took off his coat. It was charcoal cashmere, and for the past 40 minutes, it had absorbed the scent of champagne, perfume, and an evening that was now dead. He laid it over Clara Quinlan's shoulders. He didn't fasten it, he didn't straighten it, and he didn't reach out to help her stand. That was what Clara would remember more clearly than the cold, long after everything was over. People had dragged her, shoved her, stepped on her hand. This man was the first person that night who didn't touch her. He simply stood there and waited to see whether she could rise on her own. Clara placed her palm against the pavement. The snow beneath her knees had melted into water long ago, and she could no longer feel either of her feet. The tin box was still cradled in her lap, pressed between her arm and her ribs, and it hadn't fallen once through everything that had happened. She shifted her weight onto her left leg. That knee slipped. She tried again. The second time it held, and Clara Quinlan rose to her feet in the arrival lane of the Fairmont Copley Plaza, wearing a Mafia Boss's coat over her waitress uniform, her hair disheveled, her hand torn open, without speaking a single word of thanks. She didn't thank him. She looked directly into his eyes, and he looked back at her, and they both understood that gratitude was meant for a favor, and this wasn't one. Sebastian turned his back and walked toward the entrance, and that was when it happened. 40 people stood on the granite steps, glasses in their hands, crumbs still clinging to their lips, their phones still recording. 40 people who, only 2 minutes earlier, had held up their cameras, as though they were watching a reality television show. Sebastian Fallon stepped onto the first stair, and they looked away, not one by one, all at once, like a flock of birds changing direction without a signal. A woman in a mink coat suddenly found her handbag deeply fascinating. A banker from Back Bay turned and began an animated conversation with a column. The phones lowered, one after another, not because anyone had told them to put them down, but because every one of them, somewhere behind the cashmere and the haze of liquor, remembered where they were and whom they were filming. Clara saw all of it. She had lived in this city for 28 years. She had waited tables for police officers, lawyers, and city council members. She had never seen 40 people become frightened at the same moment without a single one of them making a sound. Emmett Barlow placed one hand on her elbow, gently, almost politely. "Come with us, Miss Quinlan." He knew her name. No one had ever told him her name, and Clara Quinlan climbed the steps between 2 rows of people, doing everything they could not to look at her, entered the Fairmont Copley Plaza, and carried with her the tin box and a truth no one had been willing to hear for 6 years. The elevator took 40 seconds to reach the 14th floor, and no one spoke during those 40 seconds. Clara stood in the corner with the cashmere coat draped over her shoulders, melted snow dripping from her apron onto the elevator floor and gathering in a small puddle. Priscilla stood across from her, barely a foot away, staring straight at the steel doors as though something terribly important had been written there. The suite on the 14th floor wasn't a bedroom. It was where the evening had been meant to end, a living room as large as the apartment Clara had once rented in Southie, with more than 20 carefully selected guests still lingering after the crowd downstairs had dispersed. Friends of the Vane family, 2 lawyers, a woman who sat on the board of some museum. The doors opened, and Clara Quinlan stepped into a room filled with tuxedos. She crossed the wine-colored Persian rug, and every step she took left a dark, wet mark behind her, a footprint of melted snow stretching from the doorway to the center of the room. No one told her to wipe her feet. No one dared. The conversations died in exactly the same way they had died downstairs, from the edges inward, like a candle being pinched out. A man holding a glass of whiskey forgot that he was holding it, and Priscilla Vane, standing beneath the chandelier where she belonged, found her voice again. "Sebastian, you need to understand who this girl is." She spoke to the entire room, not only to him. It was the instinct of someone who had been trained since the age of 7 to understand that an audience was a weapon. She was an intern on the 4th floor. Not an engineer, an intern. My father hired her through some diversity initiative, one of those things human resources forces us to do. And I found her at 2 o'clock in the morning, Sebastian, 2 o'clock in the morning, plugging a USB drive into the research department's server. Alone, in the dark. She wasn't authorized to be on that floor. She wasn't authorized to access that server. She didn't even have a security badge that worked after 9 o'clock at night. Clara said nothing. She stood in the middle of the trail of water she had left behind and let the story flow over her. And there was something in the way she held herself that made Sebastian take notice without understanding why. She didn't react. People reacted when they were falsely accused. People argued. Clara didn't. She listened like someone who had heard this story 400 times before. And then she invented this ridiculous story, Priscilla continued, her voice growing faster, warmer, more persuasive, slipping into the rhythm of someone who was winning and knew she was winning. She claimed she had written it herself, alone. A 22-year-old girl, with no experience and no graduate degree, supposedly designed the entire architecture of Sentinel in her rented room in Southie. Does that sound reasonable to you? She said she created Sentinel, Sebastian, and the room changed, not because of the volume of her voice, because Sebastian Fallon turned his head. He did it very slowly, more slowly than when he had turned to look at Clara in the snow, slowly enough for Priscilla to hear her own words again, and Clara saw the moment it happened across the woman's face, as clearly as watching a sheet of glass crack outward from its center. Sentinel, Sebastian said. It wasn't a question. He simply placed the name in the middle of the room as though setting a stone on a table. I've never heard that name before, Priscilla smiled. It took effort. It's only an internal product, darling. An old name no one uses anymore. You've never mentioned it to me either. No one in the room breathed. Clara realized that she was holding her breath along with 20 people she had never met, and that every one of them was waiting for the same thing. We've been engaged for 11 months, Sebastian said. His voice still didn't rise. It merely became more even, and that evenness was worse. I've listened to you talk about the Series C funding round, about the balance sheet, about the government contract your father wants. I've had dinner with you 42 times during those 11 months, Priscilla. You've never once spoken that word. Because it isn't important. Then why, he said. Did you feel the need to deny a name no one in this room knew anything about? Priscilla Vane opened her mouth. Then she closed it. And for the next 4 seconds, nothing happened. No one spoke. No one moved. Those 4 seconds lasted longer than everything that had happened beneath the falling snow. Sebastian didn't believe Clara. He wanted to make that clear to himself, and inside his own mind, he said it in a cold, precise voice. I don't believe this girl. A waitress stops my car in the middle of the night carrying a candy tin. There are 4 ways to explain this without ever needing to use the word theft. But he had spent 37 years living in a world where people weren't caught because they lied. They were caught because they said too much. And the woman he was about to marry had just voluntarily given him, in front of 20 witnesses, a name no one had forced her to reveal. He turned to Finton Doyle. Bring my laptop up here. The laptop was placed on the walnut table in the center of the room, and Finton Doyle stepped back exactly 1 pace and stood still. Sebastian didn't open it. He pushed it toward Clara. Prove it. Clara looked at the machine. Then she looked at her hands. They were trembling, not from fear, but because she had been outside for nearly an hour in a thin uniform, and only now had her body remembered it. She tucked the tin box beneath her left arm, didn't set it on the table, didn't hand it to anyone, then sat on the edge of the chair and lifted the laptop lid with 1 finger. I need internet access. Give it to her. She began to type. And that was the first detail that made Sebastian feel something didn't fit, because she never looked at the keyboard. Her hands were shaking badly enough that an ordinary person would have needed to glance down to find the keys. But Clara Quinlan's eyes remained fixed on the screen while her fingers moved on their own, finding their way, correcting themselves, fast and certain in the manner of someone who had done this for 10,000 hours. A person could invent a story. A person couldn't invent the way they typed. The Vane Analytics website appeared, white and clean and expensive, with a blue button in the center that read View Demo. Priscilla took half a step forward. Sebastian, this is company property. That girl has no right to. Sit down. She didn't sit, but she didn't take another step. Clara opened the internal repository. It ran directly on the server. a secure console filled with white text flowing across a black background like water. The kind of thing every software company displayed publicly because it looked intelligent and because no customer had ever truly read it in their life. Clara scrolled down, then farther, then she stopped. 447, she said. Look at line 447. Sebastian stepped behind the chair and bent down. In that wall of text, among hundreds of lines of commands he couldn't understand, there was one line in a paler shade of gray than the others. He read it 3 times. For the man who taught me how to weld a straight seam. The room fell silent, not the silence of fear from before. Something else. What does it mean? Sebastian asked. Clara didn't turn around. She looked at the words on the screen as though she were looking into the face of a dead man. My father, she said. Cormac Quinlan. He welded ships in Quincy for 30 years. 4 River Shipyard. Then when it closed, he worked on barges. Then anything made of metal that someone would pay him to repair. He taught me something when I was 10 years old. He said no one notices a bad weld for 10 years, and then one day the ship breaks in half at sea. He told me I could do anything I wanted, but I mustn't ever leave behind a bad weld and hope no one would know. She paused. I wrote that line at 3 o'clock in the morning, alone, in my rented room, because I was lonely and because I wanted him to be in there with me. I didn't write it for anyone to find. I didn't write it for you, or for her, or for any board. It's been there for 6 years, and no one has ever read it, because no one ever needed to. Sebastian straightened. He turned and looked at Priscilla Vane. Explain what? Her voice rose half a note. It's a note, Sebastian. A comment. Programmers write all kinds of nonsense in there. That's normal. Then when did you write it? Silence. You said you wrote Sentinel, Sebastian said. So when did you write line 447? Which night at 3 o'clock in the morning? Where were you? And who was the man who taught you how to weld a straight seam? Priscilla Vane didn't answer. She couldn't. Not because she had been caught, but because she didn't even understand well enough to invent a lie. And for the next 3 seconds, everyone in the room saw that on her face, the empty stare of someone looking at a language she had never learned. She had signed her name to it. She had sold it for $40 million. She had stood on a stage and accepted awards for it. And she had never, not once, read it. Clara Quinlan's father had been inside it for 6 years, and the woman who owned it didn't even know he was there. Sebastian looked down at the woman sitting on the edge of the chair, her hair still wet, her hands still trembling, clutching a tin box she hadn't released once since he had met her. Then he asked very softly, the first question that night, whose answer he truly wanted to know. Who brought you into Vane Analytics? Clara didn't answer at once. She closed the laptop, and there was something final in the gesture, as though she were shutting a door she would never open again. Before I answer that, she said, you need to know what the last 6 years looked like. Not so you'll feel sorry for me. So you'll understand why I was kneeling out there. Sebastian didn't sit down. He merely folded his arms and waited, and the entire room waited with him. I graduated from MIT in 2018. Computer science, full scholarship, because my family didn't have a single dollar to pay for MIT. And everyone knew it, including me. Her voice remained even, neither fast nor slow, the voice of someone reciting a list. My father worked 3 consecutive shifts for 4 months to buy me my first laptop. He didn't tell me he was working 3 shifts. I found out because I saw the pay stub in his coat pocket while I was doing the laundry. It was a cheap machine, weighed nearly 6.5 pounds, and I wrote my way through 4 years of college on it. She paused for a moment. I joined Vane Analytics when I was 22. I signed a non-disclosure agreement on my first day. 41 pages. I read 12 pages and signed it because a woman from Human Resources was standing there waiting, and I was 22, and I thought reading a contract carefully was rude. Someone among the guests made a small sound. Clara didn't look up. 11 days, she said. She filed the patent 11 days before I did. I submitted my application on a Tuesday afternoon, and they replied that a matching application had already been filed, and the name on it was Priscilla Vane. It took me 3 weeks to understand that it wasn't a mistake. She lifted her eyes to Sebastian for the first time since she had begun speaking. I sued. I thought that was simply what a person was supposed to do. I had evidence, I had work logs, I had everything. Do you know what happened? You lost. No, Clara said. Losing would have been merciful. They countersued. Vane Analytics sued me for violating the non-disclosure agreement because I disclosed the company's source code in court, to prove that it was mine. Do you understand the trap? To prove it belonged to me, I had to show it to the court. But showing it to the court meant I violated Clause 27 of the contract I signed when I was 22. Their 3 lawyers explained that to the jury for 2.5 days. My lawyer was a kind man who billed by the hour, and I could only afford 30 hours of his time. She spoke the next number without changing her tone. The court ordered me to pay $340,000. I was 23 years old, and I owed $340,000 to the woman who had taken what was mine. Priscilla Vane spoke into the silence, her voice as thin as paper. That was a ruling by a Massachusetts court, not by me. Clara didn't turn her head. She continued as though no one had spoken. 400. I submitted 400 job applications over 2 years. I counted because I needed a number I could look at. 31 times, I made it through the technical interview. 9 times, I received job offers, and all 9 disappeared within 48 hours after they ran a background check and saw 2 words on my record. Intellectual property theft. No one ever called back to explain. In America, people don't have to explain. They only send a 3-line email saying the position has been filled. She drew a short breath. My father had a stroke the day I called to tell him I'd lost the case. Not the next day, that same day. He was at the shipyard, and he put the phone down and collapsed, and someone found him 40 minutes later. He survived. But the right side of his body didn't, and now he's in a nursing home in Dorchester, where I pay $1,800 a month to keep his bed. She looked down at her hands, cracked and red, and for the first time in the entire story, her voice changed slightly. 6 years waiting tables on the night shift at Nolan's. From 10 o'clock at night until 6 in the morning, 6 days a week. It was the only job in this city that didn't ask me that question. Then she looked up. Last week, my father asked me something. He's started forgetting, you see. Once every 3 days, he doesn't remember who I am. But that day was a good day, and he looked at me and asked, "Did you really steal it?" No one in the room moved. "He's slowly forgetting everything," Clara said, "and I can't bear the thought that the last thing left in his mind about me might be someone else's lie. That's why I was kneeling out there. Not because of the money, because I'm racing against a man who's losing his memory, and I'm losing." Sebastian couldn't remember when he had sat down. He was perched on the edge of the armchair across from her, a glass of wine in his hand, and he had been holding it for 10 minutes without taking a single sip. He set the glass on the edge of the glass table. "My question still stands," he said. "Who brought you into Vane Analytics?" Clara gave a very small shrug. To her, this was the least important detail in the entire story. A name in a file, a man she had met 7 or 8 times in her life and never thought about again. "I wasn't hired through the official process," she said. "No one at MIT referred me. Someone approached me at a financial security conference in Cambridge that spring. He sat in the back row and asked me 3 questions no one else in that room had thought of. Then he asked whether I wanted to do something real instead of working on assignments. He was the one who put my file directly on Vane's desk." She paused, trying to remember. "His name was Rory." The wine glass shattered. It didn't fall at first. Sebastian Fallon shot to his feet so quickly that his knee struck the edge of the glass table, tipping the glass onto its side. It rolled once, fell onto the Persian rug, and broke into 3 pieces, while the wine spread across the wine-colored pattern in a dark stain shaped like a hand. No one picked it up. No one called for housekeeping. In 22 years of working for this man, Fintan Doyle had never seen him drop anything. "Say that again." Sebastian's voice was no longer even. Clara looked up, and she saw something on his face she didn't understand. "Rory," she repeated more slowly. "I don't know his last name. He never told me. I only remember because it was an unusual name, and because he was the only person in that company who ever spoke to me as though I knew what I was doing." Then she saw what happened behind Sebastian's shoulder. Fintan Doyle stepped forward half a pace. Only half a pace, with his left foot, and then he stopped as though he had suddenly remembered who he was and where he was standing. But the face of that 45-year-old man had changed, and Clara, who had spent 6 years reading customers' faces at 4 o'clock in the morning, recognized it immediately. That wasn't the face of a man at work. It was the face of someone who had just heard the name of a dead relative. "Rory Fallon," Sebastian said. He wasn't speaking to Clara. He was speaking to the name itself, placing it into the air for the first time in years. "My cousin. My uncle's son. He grew up in my house from the age of 11. Clara sat motionless. He was 26, Sebastian said. He died 6 years ago. On Route 3A in Quincy, at 11:40 at night. His car hit a bridge support. There was no other vehicle, no witnesses. The state police called it a single-vehicle accident, and they closed the case in 9 days. He turned back to Clara. Finton carried his coffin, front right corner. Finton Doyle said nothing. He simply stood there, and his right hand, the same hand that had drawn his phone in half a second beneath the falling snow, was clenching, opening, then clenching again. Sebastian walked to the table, opened the laptop he had just watched Clara close, and began to type. He typed slowly with 2 fingers, like a man who had never needed to do this himself. What date did you file your patent application? September 23rd, and hers? Clara didn't need to look it up. She had stared at that date for 6 years. September 12th. Sebastian stopped typing. He stood bent over the machine, and everyone in the room heard him breathe out. Rory died on September 21st, he said. No one spoke. Clara opened her mouth, then closed it, because she had just completed a calculation she didn't want to make. 9 days. Priscilla Vane had filed the patent on the 12th. Rory Fallon had driven into a bridge support in Quincy on the 21st. 9 days. Someone among the guests set a glass down on the table too hard, and the sound made 3 people flinch. Sebastian didn't turn to look at his fiancée. He didn't need to. The entire room already had. Priscilla Vane stood beneath the chandelier, her back still straight, still beautiful, still wearing the expression that 4 generations of Beacon Hill money had taught her how to maintain. There was only one detail she had forgotten. Her hand was gripping the strap of her small purse so tightly that her knuckles had turned white, white as wax, and no one knew how long they had been that way. But now all 20 people in the room were staring at them. It was 3:15 in the morning, and Clara Quinlan stood in a room on the 38th floor of a building in the seaport, looking down at Boston Harbor through a wall of glass with no curtains. From up there, she could see Pier 4. She had ridden the bus past it thousands of times and had never known who owned it. They had brought her here in a different car, not the Maybach, and no one had explained anything. Priscilla Vane had been taken back to Beacon Hill with 2 men whose company she wasn't permitted to refuse. I want to go home, Clara said. Sebastian stood beside the desk with his shirt sleeves rolled up, and he didn't turn around. No, I need to call the police. No, you don't understand. Someone is dead. I understand that better than you do. He turned to face her. But let me explain something, Miss Quinlan, because I don't think you truly know. The Boston police are something I pay every month, so they won't come. Do you understand? Not so they'll come when I call. So they won't come. That's the entire service. If you pick up that phone and call 911 from this room, the operator will log it, route it, and within 40 minutes someone will call me to ask how I want it handled. That isn't justice. It's a circle and you're standing in the middle of it. Clara stared at him. Then what about the FBI? What evidence do you have? A line of commentary inside a piece of software, and a subtraction that gives you 9 days. Take that to the federal office at Center Plaza, and they'll invite you to sit for 3 hours. Thank you for coming. And by next week, someone at Vane Analytics will know your name. Who do you think is paying their 23 lawyers? She didn't answer. You're staying here, he said. For how long? Until I tell you to leave. You're imprisoning me, I'm keeping you. He walked to the desk and poured a glass of water, not for himself. He pushed it toward her, and she didn't touch it. Your evidence, Miss Quinlan. You're the only living person who knows Rory approached you, knows why, knows the dates. Evidence doesn't move freely through this city. Evidence doesn't take a bus back to Southie at 4 o'clock in the morning. Clara set the tin box on the desk. It was the first time in Sact that it had left her hands, and the sound of metal striking wood seemed very loud. Then how am I any different from this? She asked. Sebastian looked at the box, then at her. You aren't. There wasn't a trace of malice in the answer, and that was the worst part. That's my problem, not yours. Then he turned away, and Clara understood that he had told the truth, that he wasn't trying to be cruel to her, that in the system this man had inhabited for 37 years, a human being and a hard drive truly occupied the same square on a spreadsheet, and that the only difference was that he was busy. The door opened. Emmett Barlow walked in, removed his wet coat, and brushed the snow from his shoulders. He nodded at Clara the way he might have nodded at a chair. The house on Beacon Hill is quiet, he told Sebastian. She made 4 calls, 3 to lawyers, 1 to her father. None of them left the city, and Halloran. Nothing yet. But by noon tomorrow, the entire harbor will know you canceled your flight to New York because of a waitress, and people will tell themselves the rest." Emmett poured himself a drink, swallowed it in one mouthful, and set the glass down. Then he said the next words in exactly the same tone he had used to report the weather on the drive back. "As for the girl, I think we should deal with her cleanly." Clara didn't understand at first. She heard each word separately. Deal with her cleanly. And for a second and a half her mind was still trying to assemble them into a sentence about documents, a contract, some kind of payment. Then she looked at Emmett Barlow's face and saw that he wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Sebastian. He was waiting. "She's living evidence of something no one wants to exist," Emmett continued, gentle and reasonable. "Vane will want her gone. Halloran will want her talking, and you're standing between them. 40 people downstairs have already seen her face. The longer we wait, the more expensive it becomes." Clara stood perfectly still. For 6 years, she had been afraid of many things. Afraid of letters from the bank, afraid of calls from the nursing home, afraid of the day her father stopped having good days altogether. But never once had she stood in a room while 2 men discussed whether she should continue to exist, using the same tone people used to ask whether anyone wanted more coffee. She had thought she had come to ask a wealthy man for justice. She had been wrong. Sebastian Fallon said nothing for a long time. He looked through the glass down toward Pier 4, where the crane stood motionless beneath the yellow lights. "Not now," he said. That was all. He didn't say no. He only said not now. Emmett Barlow nodded, put his coat back on, and left the room like a man who had received the answer he needed. And Clara Quinlan stood there on the 38th floor, and for the first time in that long night, her knees began to shake. The man they called at 7 o'clock in the morning was a cybersecurity specialist in Cambridge, whom the Fallon organization still kept on its payroll and had never once needed to use. He read through the demo for 2 hours, and when he finally looked up, his face had gone white. "This isn't financial analysis software," he said. "Then what is it? It's a bloodhound." He turned the screen around. "Miss Quinlan, correct me wherever I'm wrong. This thing doesn't analyze markets. It doesn't predict prices. It does only one thing. It looks at a flow of money and finds the hand reaching into the middle of it. It doesn't look for a thief on the outside. It finds the thief within." Clara nodded once. "Rory gave me the problem," she said. "He didn't tell me whose problem it was. He told me to imagine an organization with money flowing through 300 points, and that one person among them was taking 2% each time without anyone noticing. He asked me how I would find that person without knowing beforehand who it was. I thought it was a puzzle. I liked puzzles." The room fell silent. Sebastian stood against the glass wall with his back to the harbor. "Continue," the man from Cambridge swallowed. "Sir, it has already been running. Not the demo, the real system. It has logs. It has been running against an actual dataset for the past 6 years, and that dataset he stopped. Say it belongs to you, no one moved. Terminal 4, Terminal 6, Local 1188, 31 shell companies, 6 years. It knows every dollar, sir. It knows who signed, who transferred, who took. If this falls into the hands of federal prosecutors, it won't merely be evidence. It will be a finished indictment for roughly 200 people." Sebastian didn't move. "Rory didn't build it to sell," Clara said softly. She was speaking slowly, as though she had only just begun to understand her own words. "He built it to release inside his own house." Sebastian Fallon looked at her, and for the first time in 12 hours, he had nothing to say. The cousin he had raised from the age of 11 had hired a 22-year-old student to build a bloodhound, then released it into Sebastian's own organization without ever saying a single word to him. "Who sold the access?" he asked. It took 4 hours. At noon, Finton Doyle placed a file on the table without saying anything, and Sebastian read the name inside it, then sat down very slowly. Wendell Krieg, 58 years old, accountant for the Fallon organization for 20 years. The man who had stood in the 3rd row at Sebastian's father's funeral. The man who had handled payroll for 200 people every month, for 2 decades, without ever being wrong by a single cent. $340,000 in debt at Foxwoods, accumulated over 14 months, paid off in 1 week in September 6 years earlier. They brought him in at 2 o'clock that afternoon. Wendell Krieg entered the room on the 38th floor, saw the file on the table, and asked no questions. He simply stood there for a moment, then his knees folded beneath him, and he sank onto the carpet, a 58-year-old man wearing a V-neck sweater, and he began to talk. He spoke very quickly. He spoke about those 14 months, about the night he thought he could win it all back, about the woman from Vane Analytics who called him and said she needed only one very small thing: read access, not write access, and that no one would be harmed. He said he didn't know Rory. He said he didn't know what had happened on Route 3A. He said he had 3 children, 2 attending Northeastern, the youngest 11 years old, and he spoke their names, all 3 of them, aloud in that room. Clara stood in the corner and couldn't look away. Sebastian listened to everything. He didn't interrupt once. He let the man speak until there were no words left, until only the sound of his breathing remained. And then, in that silence, Sebastian Fallon nodded. Once, Fintan Doyle stepped forward, took Wendell Krieg by the elbow, and led him out of the room. The door closed. Clara waited for some sound. None came. At 7 o'clock the following morning, the Krieg family home in Milton was listed for sale. By 9, all 4 of their bank accounts had been frozen because of a civil dispute no one had ever heard of. By noon, the 2 older children received emails from Northeastern's financial office, informing them that the tuition for the current term hadn't been paid, and that their enrollment had been canceled in the middle of the semester. By that afternoon, Wendell Krieg's license to practice as a certified public accountant had been suspended pending investigation. 48 hours after he knelt on that carpet, the entire family left Massachusetts in a rented car, and nowhere in the city of Boston would there ever again be an office, a company, or an acquaintance willing to answer his call. He was still alive. That was the worst thing Sebastian Fallon could do to him, and both men knew it. Clara read the news on the screen, one line at a time, then turned to look at the man standing before the glass wall. "What did you just do?" Sebastian didn't turn around. "I gave him what he chose when he took the money." Fintan Doyle set the press release on the table at 9 o'clock that evening, placing it face down at first, as though he wanted to give Sebastian 3 more seconds. "You should read this." It was a 4-paragraph article on the financial page of the Boston Globe. Published 11 days earlier, the kind of thing no one in the organization had any reason to read. Vane Analytics signs a $40 million contract with Halloran Maritime to provide compliance analytics and supply chain risk monitoring solutions. In the photograph, Priscilla Vane was shaking hands with a 56-year-old silver-haired man in a gray suit. Sebastian stared at the picture for a long time. "Neil Halloran doesn't need software," he said. "No," Fintan said. Neither man spoke again for 20 seconds. Clara sat at the far end of the table, watching them look at one another, and she realized they had both understood something at the same moment. Something neither of them wanted to say first. "Who is Halloran?" she asked. Sebastian didn't take his eyes from the photograph. "Boston Harbor has 2 halves," he said. "My father and his father divided it in 1984. Piers 4 and 6 went to my family. Piers 9 and 11 went to his. Over the past 20 years, Neil Halloran has tried 3 times to take my share. The first time he lost 2 men. The second time he lost a building. The third time he lost his younger brother. He set the paper down. He didn't try a 4th time. People said he had grown old. People said he had learned. I believed it too. He didn't grow old," Fintan said. "He only changed weapons." Clara looked from one man to the other. "I still don't understand. Why would he buy Priscilla's software?" Sebastian turned to her, and he answered in a voice so even that Clara would remember it for the rest of her life. "You created something that can find a thief inside an organization," he said. "You think its value lies in catching the thief. It doesn't. Its value lies in the fact that before it can catch the thief, it has to map the entire flow of money. It has to know where the money comes from, where it goes, whose hands it passes through, where it stops, and how many times it changes its name. Your bloodhound, Miss Quinlan, has to draw a map of the house before it can hunt the rat." Clara sat perfectly still. "Niall Halloran doesn't need to catch any thief," Sebastian said. "He needs the map." She felt something cold travel down her spine. "He isn't planning to use it," Fintan said. "He's planning to send it away." "Send it to whom?" "To the Federal Building at Center Plaza," Sebastian said. An envelope. No return name. Inside it, 6 years of the Fallon organization's money flows, mapped, marked, and arranged by individual. No investigator would need to spend 3 years reconstructing it. Everything would already be there. It would be a packaged indictment produced by a legitimate analytics company in the seaport, complete with invoices, contracts, and official seals. He rose and walked toward the glass wall. Then Niall Halloran would take my 2 peers without firing a single bullet. He wouldn't even need to dirty his hands. The United States government would do it for him, and people would call it justice. Clara could hear the blood pounding in her ears. But she hasn't connected it to your organization yet, she said. Sentinel needs real data to run. It has to be connected from the inside. Your accountant only sold partial read access. That isn't enough to. She stopped. She stopped because she had just seen it, and she saw it on Sebastian's face before she could finish the thought. Fintan Doyle was the one who said it aloud. The wedding. No one answered. She'll be your wife, Fintan said slowly. After the wedding, she'll be part of the family, legally, with her name on the paperwork. It's the perfect cover-up, sir. She gets to integrate her software to permanently erase the tracks of her 6-year theft, while handing the map of our entire harbor over to Halloran. And that proposal has been sitting on your desk for 3 months, remember? Family Enterprise Systems Integration. She gave you a folder at dinner in April. She said the organization needed modernization, transparency, and a compliance layer to reduce risk. You told me to review it. I told you it was harmless. He stopped. Sir, I told you it was harmless. Sebastian Fallon said nothing. He stood looking down at Pier 4, where 3 cranes were moving containers beneath the lights, where roughly 40 people were working the night shift, none of them knowing that their names were already sitting inside a file in the seaport. He didn't strike the table. He didn't shout. Not a single muscle in his face changed, and that was what made Clara Quinlan. Sitting 16 feet away, more afraid than she had been when Emmett Barlow suggested dealing with her cleanly. 11 months, Sebastian said softly, almost to himself. She sat across from me at dinner 42 times. He turned around. Fintan. How long until the wedding? Fintan Doyle didn't need to check a calendar. 6 weeks. Gideon Ashcroft was the chief technology officer of Vane Analytics. 44 years old, and he was the only person in that company who knew how to read what Clara Quinlan had written. Fintan Doyle invited him for coffee at 10 o'clock in the morning at a small cafe in Fort Point, a place with 4 tables and a single window overlooking the channel. Fintan didn't threaten him. Fintan had never needed to. He poured coffee for both of them, sat down, and placed a stack of photographs on the table. 9 pictures. A 13-year-old girl in a navy blue uniform stepping out of a car on Commonwealth Avenue. The same girl waiting at the school gate. The same girl leaving school at 3:15, carrying a violin case. 9 photographs, taken on 9 different days from 9 different angles. Fintan didn't say a single word about them. He simply pushed the photographs across the table, drank his coffee, and looked out at the channel. Gideon Ashcroft broke in 11 minutes. He didn't cry. He spoke very softly and very quickly, like a man trying to force something out of his body as fast as he could. He said he was the one who altered the metadata. He said Priscilla Vane had called him into her office one September afternoon 6 years earlier and told him there was an administrative error that needed to be corrected. And he knew it wasn't an administrative error, and he did it in 20 minutes. He moved the file creation date backward. He rewrote the version history. He reassigned the original authorship to another account. He said he had done it in 20 minutes, and afterward he hadn't slept properly for 6 years. He said he would sign a statement. Fintan asked whether he was certain. He said he was, and then he asked whether his daughter could be kept out of it, and Fintan Doyle said yes. They arranged to meet at 9 o'clock the following morning, at the law office of Theodora Laws in Roxbury. The only public interest attorney Clara still knew after 6 years, a 29-year-old woman who worked in a building without an elevator. Teddy had already prepared the conference room. She bought an extra box of pastries because she thought it would be more polite. Gideon Ashcroft didn't come. At 7:15 that morning, Emmett Barlow called Sebastian and said 8 words. Ashcroft died last night. Fell from his balcony, a 9th-floor apartment in Back Bay, the rear side overlooking an alley. He was found at 5:40 in the morning. The Boston police closed the case in 4 hours. Suicide. No note, no sign of a struggle. The door locked from the inside. A 44-year-old man under pressure at work. That was what the report said, and the Globe gave him 4 lines on page 17. Fintan Doyle entered the room on the 38th floor at 8 o'clock that morning, and remained standing in the doorway. It wasn't us, sir. I know, Sebastian said. He was standing before the glass wall, and he had been there since receiving the call. Clara sat at the table with both hands wrapped around a glass of water that had gone cold long ago, and she said nothing because there was nothing she could say. She had slept the night before. That was what she would remember. While a man she had never met stepped out onto his balcony, she had slept for 6 uninterrupted hours for the first time in weeks. By noon, Emmett returned with footage from the hallway camera in the Back Bay building, footage the police had watched and discarded because they hadn't seen anything unusual. They played it on the large screen. 9:40 at night. A young man in a black coat entered the frame, carrying a large bouquet wrapped in craft paper. He walked to the door of apartment 903. The door opened. The flowers were accepted. The door closed. The deliveryman turned away and disappeared from the frame within 40 seconds. Nothing happened. There was nothing to see. Only a bouquet delivered at 9:40 at night. "Stop," Clara said. She rose and walked toward the screen. Enlarged the wrapping paper, Emmett Barlow zoomed in. In the lower right corner of the craft paper was a small stamp in olive green ink, shaped like a laurel branch with 3 interlocking initials. Clara stared at it for a long time. Then she turned and looked at Sebastian. "I stood outside that hotel for 4 hours," she said, "before you arrived. I stood by the service entrance because I wasn't allowed through the front doors, and for 4 hours, I watched people carry flowers inside. Wedding flowers, table arrangements, flowers for the lobby. The same paper, the same stamp. No one in the room said anything." "That's the florist from the engagement party," Clara said. Sebastian Fallon stared at the screen. He didn't ask her to repeat herself. He didn't demand verification. He simply stood there, and in that silence, Finton Doyle said the final thing, his voice rough. "I sat with him for 11 minutes, sir. He told me 3 times that he was afraid to go out onto his balcony. He had been terrified of heights since childhood. His former wife grew plants out there, and he never watered them once." Clara Quinlan went back to the night shift on Thursday because she said that if she took another week off, Bridget would be left short-staffed and she would lose her job, and because $700 a week was still $700 a week, whether the world was collapsing or not. Emmett Barlow didn't like it. He stationed 2 men in a car parked diagonally across Broadway, and they sat there for 8 hours every night. And by the 3rd day, Bridget Nolan brought coffee out to them because she said she couldn't stand watching people sit outside her diner in the cold without anything to drink. At 4:10 on Saturday morning, the bell above the door of Nolan's diner rang, and Sebastian Fallon walked in alone. No car, no Finton, no Emmett. He had walked from somewhere, and snow clung to the shoulders of his coat, and for the first time in 12 years, that man had entered a doorway without anyone going in ahead of him. There were 3 people in the diner, a truck driver asleep at a corner table, Clara behind the counter, and Bridget Nolan, 68 years old, wiping down the coffee machine with a cloth older than Clara. She looked him over once, from head to toe, and she wasn't afraid. "Sit wherever you like," she said. "Except table 4. That chair's been broken since Reagan was president." Sebastian sat on a stool at the counter. Bridget poured coffee without asking, black. 1 sugar. She set the cup in front of him. "I know who you are," she said. "Don't make that face. I poured coffee for your grandfather at this counter for 11 years. Declan Fallon. He sat on the exact stool you're sitting on, Tuesdays and Fridays, and he thought exactly what you're thinking now." Sebastian looked up. What did he think? That money could fix people. She hung the cloth on its hook. "He died alone in an apartment in Charlestown, you know. He wasn't shot. There was simply no one beside him. They found him 4 days later because the neighbors noticed the smell. He had $17 million in 6 banks and not a single person to call. I tell that story to everyone, so don't think I'm giving you special treatment." She walked away to wipe down a table. Clara stood at the other end of the counter with a coffee pot in her hand, and she didn't come closer. Sebastian had to speak across the 16 feet between them. "I had someone review your file," he said. $340,000 plus 6 years of interest comes to $491,000. I can pay it this week, without going through the courts. Vane Analytics will receive payment from a fund in Delaware, and they'll sign a release of the lien within 48 hours, and your name will be cleared from the credit system within 3 months. Clara said nothing. "The nursing home in Dorchester has a 3-star rating," he continued. "There's a private facility in Wellesley with a neurologist on duty 24 hours a day, $12,000 a month. I'll pay for your father's care for the rest of his life. They can move him next week. She still said nothing. And there's a house in Milton, he said. And that was where he made his mistake, though he didn't know it yet. 3 bedrooms. It's vacant. You can move in whenever you like. At table 6, Bridget Nolan stopped wiping. Clara set down the coffee pot. Wendell Krieg's house, she said. Sebastian didn't answer. You just offered me the house you took from a man with 3 children. She didn't say it loudly. There was no one in the diner who needed to hear. Do you hear yourself? He opened his mouth. She didn't let him speak. You aren't apologizing to me, Clara said. You're settling an account. Those are 2 different things, Mr. Fallon. And I don't think anyone has ever told you that. So I'm telling you now. An apology is when you see what you've done and allow it to remain inside you. A settlement is when you write down a number so you can push it out of yourself. You're doing the second and calling it the first. She took a cloth and wiped at a coffee spill on the counter, though no one had spilled anything. I don't owe you $340,000. Priscilla Vane owes me 6 years. My father owes me one evening when he remembers my name. Neither of those things is for sale in Delaware. I can fix the financial part within 48 hours. I know, she said. That's exactly the problem. You can fix the financial part within 48 hours. So you think money is the only thing that was broken. Sebastian Fallon sat on the counter stool, where his grandfather had once sat, and he had nothing to say. That hadn't happened to him in 12 years. He had sat across from federal prosecutors, union presidents, and Niall Halloran at a table with 2 guns underneath it. And he had always had the next sentence. Now he didn't. He looked down at his coffee. Bridget Nolan walked past carrying a stack of plates, and she didn't look at him, but she spoke loudly enough for the entire empty diner to hear. The sugar's in the jar. Put it in yourself. No one here is waiting on you. The nursing home in Dorchester smelled of floor cleaner and chicken soup, and that smell never changed, no matter how many times the windows were opened. Room 208 was at the end of the hallway beside the fire exit, the cheapest location in the building. The nurse at the desk looked Sebastian Fallon over once and asked who he was, and he said he was a family acquaintance, and she wrote it in the log without asking anything more. Cormac Quinlan was 64 years old. He sat in a wheelchair facing the window, the right half of his body folded into the shape a human body takes after a major stroke, his right hand resting on his lap like something someone had forgotten there. His hair was still thick. That was the detail Sebastian hadn't expected. He still had thick gray hair and the face of a man who had spent his life working outdoors, and he didn't look like a patient. He looked like a laborer resting between shifts. The doctor called it vascular dementia. Once every 3 days, he didn't recognize his daughter. Today was a good day. Sit down, Cormac said without turning around. Standing there casting a shadow means I can't see outside. Sebastian sat in the plastic chair beside the bed. Cormac turned the wheelchair around using his left hand, slowly, taking nearly 20 seconds, and he wouldn't let anyone help him. Then he looked at the man in the expensive coat sitting in his room. Are you a friend of my girl's? Sebastian had prepared an answer on the way there. 4 answers, in fact. He was an acquaintance. He was an employer. He was helping with a legal matter. All of them were true, and all of them were easy. He heard his own voice give a different answer. No, he said. I'm the man who believed the lie about your daughter. Cormac Quinlan didn't ask him to repeat it. He didn't frown. He simply sat there and looked at Sebastian for a very long time, long enough that the breathing machine in the room next door could be heard through the wall as clearly as though it were in the same room. Then he nodded once, slowly. Yes, he said. A lot of people did. Sebastian said nothing. You think you're the first? Cormac asked. 6 years. Do you know how many people believed it? 3 lawyers, 12 jurors, 400 companies. That woman at church who asked me what Clara was doing these days, and then answered the question herself. You're only one more person, son. Don't imagine you're special. Sebastian looked down at his hands. I came to tell you that I know the truth now, and then what? I came to. He stopped. He didn't know what he had come to do. You came so I could tell you it was all right, Cormac said. His voice wasn't harsh. That was the worst part. You came so an old man in a wheelchair could applaud you and say you did your best. Listen to me. He leaned forward, his left hand gripping the arm of the wheelchair. Then go fix it. Don't sit here asking me to forgive you. I don't have that right. I'm not the one who had 6 years taken from me. I'm only the one who sat and watched. My girl has that right, and you'll have to go ask her yourself. And I'm warning you now. She won't make it easy for you. Because I raised her, and I know her. He sat back again. His breathing had grown slightly heavier after speaking for so long. In the hallway, Clara Quinlan stood 2 steps from the door. She had been there since Cormac turned his wheelchair around. She didn't enter. She simply leaned against the wall with one hand covering her mouth, and she listened. Inside the room, Cormac Quinlan looked out the window for a while. Then he turned back, and something in his eyes had slipped away, had gone somewhere else, the way a door closes in the wind. "What was your name again?" he asked. "Sebastian. Sebastian." He nodded pleasantly, kindly, as though greeting a visitor who had only just arrived. "What kind of work do you do, Sebastian?" And Sebastian Fallon sat in a plastic chair inside room 208 of a 3-star nursing in Dorchester, facing a welder who had just forgotten the last 3 minutes, and he couldn't answer. He had answered that question thousands of. He worked in transportation. He worked in logistics. He worked at the harbor. He had 4 answers for 4 different kinds of people, and every one of them was waiting inside his mouth. Not one of them would come out, because the man asking had told him, 3 minutes earlier, that he was merely one more among 400 people who had believed the lie, and because there was only one honest answer, and it was this: "I make my living making people afraid to look at me." Sebastian said. Cormac Quinlan waited politely, his left hand resting on his lap. In the hallway, Clara closed her eyes. "I don't know yet," Sebastian said. It struck Clara at 2 o'clock in the morning while she was wiping down table 4, the one with the chair that had been broken since Reagan was president, and it came back not like a memory, but like a collision. She straightened in the middle of the diner and said aloud to no one, "He sent me something." The last time she had seen Rory was at a bar in Kendall Square in September 6 years earlier. He had paid for the beer, and he had looked as though he hadn't slept enough, and he had said something she took as a joke. He said he was going to send her a build, the latest version, complete with its run logs, and that she should keep it somewhere outside the company. Then he said the other thing: "If anything happens to me, don't trust anyone named Vane." Clara had laughed. She remembered clearly that she had laughed, and she remembered saying something about him watching too much movies, and Rory Fallon had laughed with her. And 10 days later he drove into a bridge support in Quincy. And she hadn't thought about those words once in the 6 years since. "Where is that email?" Sebastian asked. There wasn't an email. She sat down on a counter stool, her eyes lowered. He didn't send it through company email. He sent it to an offline encrypted security profile we set up, using a local decryption key file that existed only on that physical hard drive. Without that key, the mail server itself was completely unreadable. She stopped. "That laptop is gone," Finton Doyle, standing in the doorway, asked quietly. "Did you sell it?" "No," Clara said. "I smashed it." She didn't look at anyone. The afternoon the court handed down its verdict. I went home, and my father was lying in Boston Medical Center, and I had just signed a piece of paper saying I owed $340,000. I carried that laptop into the backyard and smashed it against the concrete steps until it broke apart, because it was the only thing in the house I was allowed to destroy. I was 23 years old, and I was stupid, and I destroyed the most expensive thing my father had ever bought in his life. No one said anything. I swept the pieces into a garbage bag. I threw it into the dumpster at the mouth of the alley. 3 hours later, Theodora Laws called. Teddy had volunteered to clean out Cormac's room, because the nursing home had announced that it was reorganizing the floor and every personal belonging had to be inventoried. And Clara couldn't afford to take even 1 day off to do it herself. Teddy called at 5 o'clock that afternoon, and there was something strange in her voice. "Clara, your father has a toolbox." "Yes, his welding box. He won't let anyone touch it. I had to open it for the inventory." Teddy paused. "There aren't any tools inside the old steel box. Beneath a cloth lining blackened by oil, there was no welding torch, no clamp, no welding rods. There was a rag. There was a photograph of Clara at 10 years old standing beside a barge. And there was a hard drive removed from its casing, one corner of its plastic edge cracked, wrapped in 2 layers of newspaper and sealed inside a zippered plastic bag." Clara sat down on the floor of Nolan's diner and couldn't speak for 15 seconds. He had gone into the backyard. He had stood there and watched his daughter smash the thing he had worked 3 consecutive shifts for 4 months to buy, and he hadn't said a word. He had let her break it, and then, after she went inside, he had gone out and swept through the wreckage and found the one thing that was still whole. He didn't know what it was. A weary, retired welder didn't know what a hard drive was. He only knew it was the hardest piece among the fragments, and that it hadn't cracked. And he had wrapped it in newspaper the way a man wraps something that might still be useful. And he had placed it where he kept the most important things in his life, and he had never told her. Then he had suffered the stroke, and whatever he had meant to tell her had remained inside that box. The man from Cambridge needed 4 hours to read it. The hard drive was still alive. 71% of the data was recoverable, and Clara Quinlan's personal mailbox remained intact inside it, along with a message sent at 11:52 at night on September 18th, 6 years earlier, 3 days before the sender died. Attached was a compressed file, 412 megabytes. Inside it was the final build of Sentinel, and deeper inside, in a folder named Runs, was the log from its final execution against live data, completed at 3:14 in the morning on September 21st. The day Rory Fallon died, Clara opened it. The screen came alive in the room on the 38th floor, and Sebastian Fallon stood behind her, and Fintan Doyle stood in the doorway, and not one of the three of them breathed. She stared at the name displayed on the first line of the results. Her hands, resting above the keyboard, stopped in midair and didn't come down. The first line contained only 4 words. Matched subject, Priscilla Vane. No one said anything. Clara scrolled down. Beneath that name were 314 lines, and every line was a date, a number, a transfer point. The bloodhound had found the hand reaching into the middle, and it had recorded every single time, and it had done so silently for 4 months until 3:14 in the morning on September 21st, when it finished running and printed out a name. Read the first date, Sebastian said. His voice sounded perfectly normal. Clara scrolled back to the top of the list. September 2018. From the doorway, Fintan Doyle spoke softly. You met her in 2024. No one answered him. The words remained in the middle of the room, and no one needed to pick them up. 9 years. Priscilla Vane had been siphoning money from the Fallon organization for years before she ever entered the same room as Sebastian Fallon. She hadn't stolen from him because she knew him. She had come to know him because she had already been stealing from him. 2%, Clara said. She was reading, and her voice grew quieter. 2% every time. Through 31 shell companies. Never enough in a single transfer to attract attention. That's exactly the problem Rory gave me. He didn't give me a theory. She looked up. He already knew. He knew someone was taking money. He simply didn't know who, and he didn't trust anyone enough to ask, so he hired a 22-year-old girl from outside to build a machine that could find the answer for him. Sebastian sat down. He lowered himself very slowly into the nearest chair, and he no longer looked at the screen. It finished running at 3:14 in the morning, Clara said. It printed her name. Rory saw it that morning. She swallowed. He died late that same night. In the room on the 38th floor, there was no sound except the hum of the air conditioner. Who was he planning to take it to? Fintan asked. No one answered, because they all knew. He hadn't trusted anyone inside the organization. He hadn't trusted Fintan, hadn't trusted Emmett, hadn't trusted the accountant, hadn't trusted the lawyers. But at 3 o'clock that morning, he had a name in his hands, and he lived for only a few more hours. And in those 20 hours, there was only one person in the world Rory Fallon would have taken it to. Sebastian Fallon looked down at the floor. He was driving back to Boston, he said. Route 3A runs from Quincy back here. Clara raised a hand to cover her mouth. He was on his way to me. No one corrected him. No one said anything at all. Sebastian sat motionless for a very long time. Long enough for Clara to hear a clock ticking somewhere in the apartment. Long enough for Fintan Doyle, who had stood beside this man for 22 years, to look away. He didn't strike the table. He didn't throw anything. He didn't raise his voice. He simply sat there with both hands resting on his knees, staring down at an empty place on the carpet. Then he lifted his head and looked at Clara Quinlan. Do you know what you've done? He said. She shook her head. In 6 weeks I was going to marry her, Sebastian said. Her name would have been placed on the family documents. She would have connected this thing to my organization legally, and 6 months later, an unmarked envelope would have arrived at Center Plaza, and I would have gone to prison for 20 years without ever knowing why. I would have died in there, still believing Rory was killed by an icy road. He stood. You saved my life, he said, by smashing a laptop. Clara couldn't speak. She was thinking about 6 years, about 403 line emails, About all the nights she carried coffee from 10 o'clock at night until 6 in the morning, while that hard drive sat inside her father's toolbox, 10 feet from where she slept, silent, complete, waiting. She had possessed it from the very beginning. She had carried evidence of a murder in her hands for 6 years, and she had believed she had lost nothing more than a line of code. Then Fintan Doyle spoke. He spoke from the doorway without stepping inside, and his voice was rough in the way a man's voice becomes rough when he has held something in his throat for too long. "Sir?" Sebastian turned. "Give me 2 hours." No one breathed. "She'll never be found." The room became utterly still. Fintan Doyle stood there, 45 years old, the man who had carried the front right corner of that coffin, and he didn't look at Clara, and he wasn't making an offer. He was asking. Sebastian Fallon didn't answer him. He turned his head slowly and looked at the woman sitting before the screen. Clara rose from the chair and stepped between the two men. "No," Fintan Doyle didn't look at her. "You don't understand this." "I understand perfectly," Clara said. "You want to kill her, and if you kill her, I'll remain a thief until the day I die, except there'll be no one left alive to argue otherwise." She turned to Sebastian. "Promise me, right now, no one touches her." He looked at her for a long time. Then he said yes. He would regret that answer for months. Priscilla Vane didn't run. That was the one thing no one in that room had anticipated, including Emmett Barlow, who had stationed 2 teams at Logan Airport for 4 straight days. She didn't book a flight. She didn't move any money. She didn't call Halloran. On Tuesday morning, she filed a lawsuit. Clara Quinlan, defendant. 3 civil charges: systematic harassment, trespass, and extortion by threat. The complaint was 46 pages long, and it contained everything. It contained the civil judgment from 2021. It contained the security report about the incident in the arrival lane of the Fairmont Copley Plaza. It contained 7 cell phone videos recorded by guests that night, edited so that each clip began at the exact second Clara rushed into the street and ended before Priscilla reached down. In all 7 clips, a woman in a waitress uniform ran into the road to block the car of a couple on their way to their own engagement party and screamed. That was all. That was everything visible in the frame. On Wednesday evening, WBZ aired a 4.5-minute report. Priscilla Vane sat in the living room of her Beacon Hill home, wearing little makeup and a gray sweater, and she cried beautifully. She didn't say a single cruel word about Clara. That was the most frightening part. She said she felt sorry for the girl. She said the girl had once been very talented, and that she had tried to help her, but some things couldn't be helped. She said she was afraid, not for herself but for her fiancé, whom she described as a man so kind-hearted that he could easily be exploited. The headline remained beneath the screen for all 4.5 minutes. Waitress obsessed with female CEO is Fallon being exploited. By Thursday morning, 11 newspapers and news sites across New England had picked up the story. By noon, the video of Clara kneeling in the snow had 6 million views, and there wasn't a single person in the comments defending her. On Friday, an inspector from Boston Inspectional Services visited Nolan's diner at 11 o'clock in the morning. He checked the refrigerator temperature. There was nothing wrong. On Saturday, they returned at 7 o'clock in the morning and inspected the grease drainage system. They recorded 2 minor violations. On Monday, they came back for a 3rd time, 3 of them carrying measuring equipment, and this time they stayed for 4 hours and found 19 violations in a diner that had operated continuously for 31 years, without a single complaint. Bridget Nolan stood outside the entrance with the temporary closure notice posted on the glass. She said nothing. She simply stared at it for a long time, still holding the cleaning cloth in her hand. 31 years. "You know what this is," Clara said. "I know," Bridget replied. "I opened this diner when I was 37. My husband died before it ever turned a profit. It took me 14 years to pay off the debt." She folded the cloth very neatly and placed it in her pocket. "Don't apologize to me, girl. If I had to choose between this diner and letting that woman win, then I've already made my choice." But when she turned away, Clara saw the curve of her back, and Clara Quinlan lost the last job she had at 2 o'clock on Monday afternoon, 37 days before the wedding. On the 38th floor, Sebastian Fallon read the report and said nothing. He could end all of it with one phone call. He knew the name of the district supervisor at Inspectional Services. He had dined with the man twice. One call, 60 seconds, and the diner would reopen the following morning, and those 19 violations would melt away like snow. He could call the editors-in-chief of 2 of those 11 newspapers. He could make the video with 6 million views disappear within 4 hours. For 20 years, that was precisely what people had paid him to be able to do. He set the report down on the table. He didn't pick up the phone, because if he made that call, he would be touching her, and because 4 days earlier, a woman had stood in the middle of this room and made him promise, and he had promised, and it was the first promise in 12 years that left him no way around it. Emmett Barlow looked at him from across the table. "You're really going to sit there and watch?" "Yes," Sebastian said, and he sat there and watched. Cormac Quinlan's health insurance was supplemental mass health coverage, and it was registered under Clara's name because she was his legal guardian. The letter arrived on Thursday. 3 paragraphs. Due to a change in the legal record of the guarantor, your benefits are being reviewed and will be temporarily suspended effective the 30th of this month. No one's name appeared beneath it. There was no telephone number that anyone answered after 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Clara called 11 times over 2 days, and on 3 of those calls she was transferred to hold music before the line went dead. That was how things worked in America. No one refused her, no one accused her of anything. They were simply reviewing the case, and while the case was under review, no one paid, and while no one paid, a 54-year-old man lay in room 208. The nursing home called on Monday morning. The woman on the other end was very polite. She said she was terribly sorry. She said the account was 41 days overdue, and the facility's policy allowed 30. She said she had tried to hold the bed for as long as she could. She said an ambulance would transfer him to the emergency department at Boston Medical Center at 11 o'clock because it was the only place legally required to accept him. Clara was standing at a bus stop on Broadway when she received the call. She arrived at 1:20 that afternoon. The waiting room of the Boston Medical Center Emergency Department on a Monday afternoon held 40 people seated in rows of connected blue plastic chairs. A child was crying. A television mounted on the wall played a cooking program no one was watching. The room smelled of rubbing alcohol and human bodies. Cormac Quinlan sat in the 3rd row beside the aisle, in his wheelchair. A gray canvas bag rested on his lap. Inside it were all the possessions of a man who had welded ships in Quincy for 30 years. 4 shirts, 2 pairs of pants, 1 sweater, a watch with a dead battery, a photograph, and a steel toolbox. He held the bag with his left hand. He held it very tightly. He had been sitting there for 2 hours and 20 minutes, and no one had spoken to him, and he hadn't asked anyone a single question because he didn't know what he was supposed to ask. Clara walked past 40 strangers and knelt in front of her father's wheelchair, placing her hand over the left hand that clutched the bag. "Dad, it's me. I'm here." Cormac Quinlan looked down at her. He looked for a very long time. He studied her hair, her face, the cheap coat she was wearing, and he tried. She could see him trying. He was searching through a house where someone had removed every nameplate from every door. "Who are you?" he asked. It didn't hurt the way she had imagined it would. It wasn't like a knife. It was like the floor disappearing beneath her. Clara Quinlan released her father's hand and sat down on the floor of the emergency room waiting area, in the middle of the aisle, surrounded by 40 strangers, and she cried. She hadn't cried when the court handed down its judgment. She hadn't cried when the words $340,000 appeared on the paper. She hadn't cried through 400 3-line emails, hadn't cried during 6 years of carrying coffee from 10 o'clock at night until 6 in the morning. Hadn't cried while kneeling in the snow with someone's shoe crushing her fingers. Hadn't cried while telling all of it to a room filled with strangers in tuxedos. Now she cried. She cried the way people cry when there is no one left before whom they need to preserve their dignity. Aloud, her entire body shaking, both hands covering her face, on the beige vinyl floor of a public hospital. No one came to her. That was Boston. People looked away. Cormac Quinlan sat in his wheelchair holding the bag and looked down at the woman crying at his feet, and he didn't understand why. And on his face was the courteous concern of a man who wanted to help a stranger but didn't know how. At 2:15 in the morning, Sebastian Fallon found her. Cormac had been moved at 9 o'clock that night to a temporary bed in the 4th-floor hallway. Clara sat on the floor just outside that doorway, her back against the wall. She wasn't asleep. She wasn't crying anymore. She was simply sitting there. Sebastian said nothing. He didn't ask whether she was all right. He didn't say he would take care of it. He didn't mention money, the house, Wellesley, or anything else he could buy. He removed his coat, folded it, and placed it on the floor beside her. Then Sebastian Fallon sat down on the vinyl floor of a public hospital corridor in Boston, his back against a pale blue wall, beside a woman who didn't look at him. And he remained there all night. It was the first time in his life that he chose to make himself small. 4 people sat around the table on the 38th floor at 10 o'clock in the morning, and there was nothing on the table except a hard drive sealed inside a zippered plastic bag. 33 days before the wedding. Fintan Doyle spoke first, and he kept it brief. The first way, she travels to New York on business on the 17th alone. For 2 nights, no van driver. She drives herself. I need 2 men in 4 hours. No missing person report for the first 72 hours because she's out of state. After that, there'll be 1, and after that, there'll be an investigation. And the investigation won't lead anywhere, because it never does. Halloran understands the message within 2 days. The $40 million contract dies with her. Sentinel is never connected to anything, and on Monday morning, 200 people at Pier 4 and Pier 6 go to work as usual. He placed both hands on the table. That's the cheapest and cleanest way, and it has been used 3 times during the 20 years I've been here. It always works. No one said anything. Clara spoke second. Her voice was rough because she hadn't slept in 30 hours. The second way. This hard drive goes to the United States Attorney's Office at Center Plaza. Intact. Nothing removed. Nothing altered. It proves that Priscilla Vane siphoned money from this organization for 6 years, and it records the final run at 3:14 in the morning, on the day Rory Fallon died. It's the only thing in the world that can put her on trial, and it's the only thing in the world that can erase those 2 words from my record. Emmett Barlow gave a short laugh, but there was nothing amused in it. Fintan Doyle didn't laugh. He stared at Clara for a long time, then turned to Sebastian, and when he spoke, his voice rose for the first time in 22 years. Do you understand what she just said? Sebastian didn't answer. That hard drive doesn't only have Mrs. Vane's name on it, Fintan said. It has everyone's name. It contains 6 years of money flows. 31 companies. My name, Emmett's name, your name, and the names of 190 other people, 90% of whom have never heard of Priscilla Vane in their lives. Dermot Casey has driven a forklift at Pier 6 for 19 years. His name is on there because his wages passed through one of those 31 companies. He didn't choose that. You chose it for him in 2014. He pointed at the zippered bag. You give this to the federal government, and you aren't putting Priscilla Vane in prison. You're putting Dermot Casey in prison. You're putting 200 families in prison. And you'll go with them. He stopped and drew a breath, and then he said the sentence everyone in that room would remember. You're going to sell out your entire house to save the name of a girl you've known for 6 weeks. No one spoke for a long time. Clara sat staring at her hands. She knew he was right. That was the worst part. The 45-year-old man sitting across from her, the man who had carried Rory's coffin, the man who had sat with Gideon Ashcroft for 11 minutes and promised to leave his daughter alone, and had kept that promise, had just said something completely true. You're right, Clara said. Fintan blinked. I know you're right. I spent all last night thinking about Dermot Casey, and I don't even know what he looks like. She raised her eyes to Sebastian. But if you choose the first way, then you're no different from her. She erased Rory because Rory knew too much. You'll erase her because she knows too much. The only difference between you is that you'll be doing it for me, and that doesn't make it clean. It only makes me dirty with you. She placed one hand on the table. And I'll still be a thief for the rest of my life. Do you understand? If she dies, my civil judgment remains, the record remains. 400 companies will still see those 2 words. I'll only be a thief protected by the Mafia, and my father will die without anyone ever telling him that his daughter didn't take anything. Sebastian Fallon sat at the head of the table. He hadn't spoken a single word in 20 minutes. You're asking me to set myself on fire, he said, and to burn everyone who trusted me with me. Yes. Do you understand what you're saying? I'm telling you that my name is worth more than your empire, Clara said. And I know that's a cruel thing to say. I practiced saying it all night, and it's still cruel. No one answered. Sebastian Fallon looked at the zippered bag on the table. The Sentinel launch took place at 10 o'clock on Thursday morning in the lobby of Vane Analytics headquarters in the seaport, 11 days after that morning around the conference table. There were 140 invited guests. There were 3 cameras. There was a live stream on the company's website and a shared feed for 2 financial news channels. Behind the stage stood a screen 13 feet high, and across it, moving slowly and beautifully, was the olive green logo of a product that not one person in that room had ever read a single line of. Priscilla Vane wore ivory. She was speaking about transparency. The doors opened at 10:22, and Sebastian Fallon walked in. The entire lobby turned toward him. Priscilla stopped in the middle of a sentence, and then she smiled, and the smile was genuine. The smile of a woman who had just won, because in her mind, there was only one way to explain his arrival. Her fiancé had finished calculating the problem, and had come to stand beside her before 140 witnesses and 3 cameras, to extinguish the lawsuit, to tell the city that the Fallon family stood behind the Vane family. She stepped aside and surrendered the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "my fiancé." Sebastian Fallon walked onto the stage. He didn't take the microphone. He turned, reached one hand behind him, and Clara Quinlan stepped up beside him. She was wearing her white shirt from Nolan's diner. She had refused everything he had offered to buy. She had ironed it the night before in an apartment that wasn't hers, and the collar was frayed, and her name tag was still pinned to it. Sebastian placed the microphone in her hand. Then he stepped back 2 paces and stood still. He would remain that way for the next 7 minutes, and he wouldn't speak a single word. Clara connected the laptop. "My name is Clara Quinlan," she said. Her voice carried through the lobby, and no one moved. "6 years ago, I wrote the thing running on the screen behind you," she typed. The 13-foot screen changed. The logo disappeared. There was only white text against a black background, and she scrolled slowly until a line in pale gray appeared, large enough to fill an entire wall. "For the man who taught me how to weld a straight seam." Line 447, Clara said. "It appears inside the product this company has just sold for $40 million. My father welded ships in Quincy for 30 years. I invite anyone in this room to explain why his name appears inside the intellectual property of Mrs. Priscilla Vane." Camera shutters clicked. Clara typed again, "This is the final run log of this software using live data." The screen changed. 314 lines, and this is the result. 4 words nearly 3 feet high. Matched subject, Priscilla Vane. Noise rose through the lobby like water. Someone in the 4th row stood up. "And this is the timestamp," Clara said. 3:14 in the morning, September 21st. She paused for exactly 1 beat. Rory Fallon died at 11:40 that same night on Route 3A in Quincy. He was the man who hired me to write this software. He lived for 19 hours after seeing that name. Priscilla Vane said nothing. She didn't deny it. She didn't call for security. She didn't speak a single word because her mouth had been trained for 33 years, and it didn't betray her. But no one had ever trained her hands. She lunged onto the stage. She seized the laptop with both hands and tore it from the table. The cable snapping free, the 13-foot screen going black, and for one moment, before 140 people and 3 cameras, broadcasting live, the woman dressed in ivory clutched the laptop against her chest and wrenched it toward herself, with the exact same motion she had used in the snow to tear a tin box from a waitress's hands. She always confessed with her hands, never with her mouth. The front doors opened. The rear doors opened. They entered from both directions, wearing dark blue jackets with 3 gold letters across their backs, and they didn't run. They walked. The first agent read Priscilla Vane her rights while she was still clutching the laptop. The second walked straight to the stage, directly to Sebastian Fallon, and read him his rights. Sebastian held out both wrists. He had negotiated with them for 11 days. He knew exactly what the next sentence would be. And at the rear entrance, beneath the emergency exit sign, Finton Doyle stood waiting. He didn't run. He had been standing there for all 7 minutes, and he had 20 seconds and an open door. And he didn't run, because in 22 years he had never run from Sebastian Fallon. And now it was too late to learn. When they called his name, he turned his head and looked across the lobby, past 140 people, and directly into Sebastian's eyes. There was no hatred in that look. There was nothing at all. Only one question, very soft and very brief. Why me? Priscilla Vane was charged with murder, but she was never tried for it. No one had seen her in Quincy that night. There was no DNA. There was only a timestamp, a bouquet delivered at 9:40 in the evening in Back Bay, and 19 hours no one could explain. Her lawyers negotiated for 7 months. In the end, she pleaded guilty to manslaughter, securities fraud, and intellectual property theft. 24 years in federal prison, with no possibility of release before serving 80% of the sentence. She was 41 years old when the door closed behind her. Sebastian Fallon cooperated fully. He gave them everything. 31 companies, 6 years of records, names, dates, and payments made to 3 police officers he had kept on his payroll for a decade. He received 4 years. With credit for cooperation and good behavior, he was released after 34 months. The Fallon organization ceased to exist within 6 weeks. 80% of its assets were seized. Pier 4 and Pier 6 were transferred to a company in New Jersey that had never heard his name. Emmett Barlow told them everything in 3 days. He received 14 months and was released early. And he returned to Boston, but there wasn't a door left in the city that would open for him. Not a bar in Southie, not a funeral, not a single person who would nod to him on the street. He remained physically whole, and he was the only person in this story who truly disappeared. Niall Halloran lost the $40 million contract. He lost Sentinel. He lost 20 years of waiting and an opportunity he would never have again at the age of 56. He wasn't charged with anything. That may have been the harshest punishment of all. Fintan Doyle received 9 years. Federal prosecutors came to see him 3 times. On the 3rd visit, they placed a full immunity agreement on the table. Not a single day in prison. Witness protection if he wanted it, in exchange for testimony against Sebastian Fallon in 3 cases only he knew about. Fintan Doyle looked at the paper and said he couldn't remember anything. They asked him again. He said he couldn't remember anything. He sat there for 4 hours and didn't speak a single word against the man who had sold him out, then signed the 9-year plea agreement with a neat, precise signature, and that was the wound Sebastian Fallon would carry until the day he died. Clara Quinlan's civil judgment was vacated in the 4th month. The Patent Office needed another 11 months to transfer authorship of Sentinel into her name, and when the document arrived, she was wiping down a table on the 2nd floor. Clara didn't wait. That was what Sebastian would understand later, that she had never waited for anyone in her life. She accepted a job at a small cybersecurity firm in Cambridge, 18 employees, no gym, and no one there who knew her name from the newspapers. She took the bus to work. Nolan's Diner reopened after 4 months, and Bridget Nolan rented Clara the 2nd floor for $1 a year, and she made Clara sign a proper lease because, as she said, business was business. The Quinlan Foundation began there, among the old tables, with Theodora Laws as its only attorney, unpaid for the first 6 months. It did only one thing. It helped young engineers whose inventions had been taken by their companies. Cormac Quinlan died in the 26th month. That morning was a bad day, and the afternoon was no better. At 4 o'clock he woke. The nurse called Clara, and she was in Cambridge, and she caught a bus and arrived at 4:41. He was lucid for 4 minutes. He looked at her, and he knew who she was. "Clara," he said. She took his hand. "I'm here, Dad." He breathed for a while. His chest rose and fell very slowly. Then he tightened his left hand around hers, the hand that still worked, and he spoke. "I know you didn't take it." She couldn't say anything. "I saved that hard drive because I knew," Cormac Quinlan said. "I didn't understand what it was. I only knew it belonged to you. I thought one day you might need to prove it, and I didn't want you to have to go looking for it." He looked at her, and his eyes were perfectly clear. "I never doubted you, my girl. Not for 1 minute." He lived for another 27 minutes. Clara sat there and cried, for the second and final time in this entire story, but this time she cried while holding his hand, not while sitting on a hospital floor. She had made it in time. For 6 years, she had raced against a man who was losing his memory, and she had made it with more than 20 months to spare. At Federal Correctional Institution Danbury, nearly 100 miles away, Sebastian Fallon received the letter 4 days after the funeral. Sebastian Fallon walked out of Federal Correctional Institution Danbury on an October morning, and there was no car waiting for him. He had told them not to come. Carrying a paper bag that held everything he owned, he boarded an intercity bus bound for South Station and sat in the 4th row on the right for 4 hours beside a woman watching a movie on her phone, and not one person on that bus knew who he was. 34 months. Clara Quinlan was waiting in the concourse at South Station beneath the departure board, holding a paper cup of coffee. She handed it to him. "Black, 1 sugar," he said. "2 sugars. He paused. "I remembered it wrong." "You'll remember it right tomorrow," she said. 1 year later, on a Tuesday evening, 7 people sat around 3 tables pushed together on the second floor of Nolan's diner. Every one of them was under 30. A young woman from Lowell, whose former company had filed a patent for her algorithm 4 days before she did. A young man from Worcester, who had just signed a 40-page contract without understanding Clause 27. Theodora Laws sat at the head of the table with a stack of files and a red pen, and she had left her public interest law office in March. Sebastian Fallon made coffee in the corner of the room. He worked as a warehouse manager for a legitimate transportation company in Everett, starting at 6 o'clock every morning, earning $42,000 a year, the only job in the state willing to hire a man with a federal conviction. He took the 112 bus to work. There were 19 people in the warehouse, and none of them knew who he had once been, and a 23-year-old kid named Petey still regularly reminded him how to stack pallets correctly. 2 things hung on the wall behind him. One was a photograph of Rory Fallon at 26, laughing at some party no one could remember anymore. Beneath it was a single engraved line. He was the first to ask the right question. Beside it, hanging from 2 nails, was a steel welding toolbox with its lid open and its interior empty. There was no nameplate, no explanation. When someone asked, Clara told them. When no one asked, it was simply an old box. Once every month, Sebastian wrote a letter to the federal prison in Pennsylvania, where Fintan Doyle was serving the 4th year of his sentence. He didn't apologize in those letters, because he had come to understand that there were some things an apology could never reach. He only told stories: the warehouse, the weather, the Red Sox. 39 letters in 39 months. Fintan Doyle hadn't answered a single one. Sebastian kept sending them. That evening, after the other 7 people had gone home, Clara poured coffee into 7 cups and raised her own. To Rory Fallon, she said, not forgotten, not erased, not for sale. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall over Fort Point. They walked home, and Sebastian stopped in the middle of the sidewalk at a place only he recognized. I can't give you back those 6 years, he said. No, I can't get Fintan back either. No, snow settled on their shoulders. All I can do is come tomorrow, he said. Clara Quinlan reached out and took his hand. It was the first time since his 34 months in prison that she was the one who touched him first. Then come, she said. She no longer knelt. He no longer bent down. They simply stood there as equals beneath the first snow of the season, in a city that had taken so much from both of them and returned very little. Clara Quinlan's story leaves us with something very simple. A name is the least expensive possession a person owns, and the most costly thing to lose. Someone can steal your money, and you may earn it back. But when someone steals your name, you have to reclaim it from one person at a time, 1 year at a time, and some people will never return it. Those 6 years taught us that violence doesn't always arrive through a fist. Sometimes it arrives through a lawsuit, a notation in a background report, or a 3-line email saying the position has been filled, and the people crushed beneath it often have no one to call for help. This story also reminds us that apologizing and settling an account are 2 entirely different things. Money can repair a number. It can't repair a human being. Sebastian Fallon had to spend 34 months in prison to learn what Clara told him in 60 seconds inside a diner at 4 o'clock in the morning. And above all, this story teaches us about respect. Cormac Quinlan didn't understand what a hard drive was. He only knew it belonged to his daughter, and he believed her when all of America did not. Sometimes respect is as simple as that, wrapping something you don't understand in newspaper, putting it somewhere safe, and waiting. If this story touched you, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share it so that every day you can hear more compelling stories like this one. How did Clara and Sebastian's story make you feel? In your own life, have you ever been misunderstood when no one was willing to listen? Has anyone ever believed in you when everyone else turned away? Leave a comment below. We truly want to hear the feelings that come from deep within your hearts. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.